today, so I don't want to waste any time. It is the second day of our fourth unit, so you do, of course, have a warm-up. Your 6 minutes to complete the warm-up begin now. So today's lesson is about the carbon cycle in the cell membrane. Like I said, we have a lot to cover, so I really want to get through and go ahead and get started. I appreciate everybody being here on time and using those 6 minutes to go ahead and knock out the warm-up. Today is February 15th, 2021. It is the second day of our fourth unit. The objective for today's lesson is to understand how carbon flows within and between systems, and also to understand the properties of the cell membrane. So we're really going to cover two things today. They're not super related, so it is going to feel at one point like we're doing an odd, switch, but bear with me. We do have two essential questions. Why is it important that carbon can be transferred? And number two, how does the cell membrane function? So again, please do make sure that you have your notes out so that you can refer to what we talked about last week and so that you can add on to it. Okay. Before we do that, as you all know, I like to start off the week with the message of positivity and sometimes with a story that I think should motivate and inspire you all to think about things outside of this class, to think about things that are bigger than you, to think about a history to which you may not have been exposed before. So in honor of the fact that yesterday was Valentine's Day, and also that we are continuing on with Black History Month, I wanted to talk about this story of love conquering racism. So some of you, I'm sure, will go on to be lawyers and have interest in law. So there is a landmark Supreme Court case called Loving v. Virginia, Loving versus Virginia, that we're going to talk about today. Just to give you a little bit of context, as many of you all, I'm sure, are aware, there was a system of Jim Crow in the South. It was a system that essentially put into law or codified racism. It really diminished the freedoms of Black people living in the South. It restricted their movement. It restricted their ability to congregate and to have meetings. It restricted their ability to receive an education. It also restricted their ability to practice a religion. And just in general, it restricted their constitutional freedoms. And I use that word constitutional intentionally because what I mean is that this system of Jim Crow and the laws that upheld Jim Crow were actually anti or counter to the U.S. Constitution, which is, of course, this document that guides all of the laws that make our country what it is. And so in reality, these were illegal laws, if you can believe that oxymoron. One of the laws that I'm referring to was known as the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. And although many states had something similar, this law applied specifically to the state of Virginia. And it prohibited, among other things, interracial marriage. We come into this story of the Lovings. Mildred Loving was a woman of mixed ancestry, including both Native American and African American, and Richard Loving was a white man. And although the fact that these two people had grown up in the same community, essentially as neighbors for their entire lives, attending the same schools, and having, birthed a child together, they could not legally marry in the state of Virginia. So what they decided to do was travel to Washington, D.C. in June 1958, shortly after Mildred became pregnant, to get married. In Washington, D.C., as was the case in most of the northern and western states, interracial marriage was legal. And so they were able to get a marriage license there. But when they returned to Virginia, they had broken the law, and they had broken several different laws, including traveling across state lines. If you can believe it, one of those laws that I refer to as Jim Crow actually prevented people of color and and white people from traveling across state lines together. It's a ridiculous law. But they also, of course, were told that this marriage license was null and void in the state of Virginia, and that as attempting to cohabitate, meaning live together as married people, they had broken a law. So the police raided their house in the middle of the night in hopes that they would actually catch them in the act of, actually sleeping together, which they did. They found them asleep in the bed. And although Mildred Loving was able to actually point to their marriage license, which was hanging above their bed, they were told that marriage license was illegal. And so they were arrested. They were faced with up to 5 years imprisonment based on the laws that they had been accused of breaking. They were then convicted, and they were told that you will be sentenced to either a year in prison, or you can agree to leave the state of Virginia and not return for at least 25 years. They chose the latter to avoid having to, put their children into, or put their soon-to-be-born child into foster care. And they moved to Washington, D.C. But they lived in Washington, D.C. in dilapidated conditions that were not like those that they left in Virginia. They couldn't be near their family. They could not be, they weren't able to continue in the same jobs that they had. They literally had lived in this community for their entire lives. And so having to uproot and move into DC was not desirable, nor was it feasible. So, of course, after a period of time, about 5 years of trying to do this, Mildred became homesick, returned to the state of Virginia, where she was arrested again, as well as Richard. And this second time, the couple decided that they were going to fight it. Those of you who are interested in law, this is when the case probably becomes more interesting to you. They were convicted of breaking this law again, and as is the case in our criminal justice system here in the United States, most people who are convicted of a crime do have the ability to appeal it. Oftentimes, it doesn't make sense to appeal because the evidence is so convincing, or because the conviction was just so petty that the amount of time and money put into it is going to be in vain. But in this case, there was a real point to be made, a real argument to be made about the unconstitutionality of this law. And so they appealed. And what happens when you appeal a case in our criminal justice system is that what you're doing is you're saying, I want another group of eyes to take a look at this decision. Although the judge or the jury originally came to this decision, I want somebody who might be better suited or have a stronger understanding of the law to relook at it, make sure everything was done correctly, make sure that the Constitution was upheld in this decision. And so they appealed, and the first time it was appealed, of course, it goes to the state Supreme Court. So it went to the Virginia Supreme Court, where the conviction was actually upheld. So the Virginia Supreme Court decided, nope, everything was done properly here. There's nothing to overturn. The case followed not only the state constitution, but also all of the federal laws of the United States Constitution. So this was the correct decision. They were not satisfied, of course, with that, and felt that their argument was strong enough. And so they appealed again. And this time, with each additional appeal, it goes up a level. So you're saying, hey, now I want even more seasoned. I want even more seasoned judges to take a look at this and decide if this were true. And then you can go up an even further level and have it looked at by the Supreme Court, which is, of course, the 9 judges that sit on the highest court of the land. Once you have a decision that is made by the Supreme Court, there can be no more appeals, unless the Supreme Court's decision is to say, we're going to return this down to a lower court's jurisdiction. Oftentimes, the Supreme Court will decide and say, no more, that's it. This is the final decision. So what happened in this case was that they appealed to the Supreme Court, and in 1967, the Supreme Court saw the case and made a decision. So let's take a look at this.
On July 11, 1958, at 2 a.m., a county sheriff entered the home of Virginia couple Richard and Mildred Loving, forced them out of their bed, and placed them under arrest. Their crime? Interracial marriage. This is the story of Loving versus Virginia and the landmark civil rights decision that would set an important precedent for marriage rights in America. Richard, who was white, and Mildred, who was Black and Native American, spent the early morning hours of July 11th in jail. They were tried and found guilty of violating Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924, a series of laws that made race mixing illegal. The Lovings were then given an ultimatum: spend 1 year in prison or leave the state of Virginia for 25 years. Frightened and unaware of their legal options, they moved to Washington, D.C., where their marriage was legal. They raised their 3 children in the nation's capital, financially strapped and isolated from friends and family. 5 years later, they returned to Virginia to visit Mildred's relatives, but were arrested for a second time for traveling together. Inspired by the burgeoning civil rights movement, Mildred decided to fight back. So in 1963, she wrote a letter to U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy asking for his advice. Kennedy referred the Lovings to the American Civil Liberties Union, who assigned their case to 2 young lawyers named Bernard Cohen and Philip Hirschkopf. Cohen and Hirschkopf took their appeal all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing that Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed African Americans citizenship and all its privileges. The broad and sweeping language of the amendment, they argued, made no mention of interracial marriage, and thus guaranteed equal protection of a human being's right to marry. Attorneys from the state of Virginia argued that the state's rights should be prioritized over federal laws. But the argument didn't hold up. On June 12, 1967, the court unanimously struck down the Virginia marriage ban and overturned the Lovings' conviction. The court ruling reverberated across America, invalidating anti-miscegenation laws not only in Virginia, but in 16 other states that held them as well. After winning their case, the Lovings were finally free to do what they wanted to do all along. They lived quietly in Virginia as husband and wife until Richard's death in 1975. On July 11th, 1958...
All right. So I bring this story up for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think it's just important that you guys know a little bit more about the history of things that have taken place in this country and all of the restrictions that have been placed on various groups of people and their ability to enjoy life as true American citizens. Again, those of you who are interested in law can explore this further, and you'll see that this case not only had important precedents, meaning that there were cases that came before it in which the Supreme Court decided differently, but also it had pretty cool effects as well in terms of its impact on interracial marriage, in terms of its impact on same-sex marriage. And so even up until recently in 2015, this case was still being cited by the Supreme Court in terms of how it makes other decisions going forward. So I wanted you guys to just be aware of that history. But of course, the other reason I bring it up is just to provide some motivation and inspiration at the beginning of the week. So I'll leave you with, not leave you, but I'll leave this discussion with this last quote from Mildred Loving. She said, "I am proud that Richard's and my name is on a court case that can help reinforce the love, the commitment, the fairness, and the family so that so many people, Black or white, young or old, gay or straight, seek in life. That's what loving and loving are all about." And so what I like about this is we're reminded of the fact that the little things that we take for granted in the year 2021 have come at a great cost and at great sacrifices for so many people who came before us. And so even when you are looking at your own personal lives and you're thinking about the things that you still need to achieve or the frustrations that you're running into as you go about your day-to-day lives, just keep in mind that there are so many reasons to be grateful. And even when there aren't that many, because we all have bad days, we all go through rough times. Some of us go through times that are objectively worse than others. We still have some opportunities to say, hey, I should be grateful for the little things, the opportunities that I have that people before me didn't have, the opportunity to move how I want to move, to live with whom I want to live, to love whom I want to love, to visit certain restaurants and shopping malls that I probably wouldn't have been able to or may not have been able to in the past, to vote how I want to. And even smaller things that come up in our lives, the opportunity for an education, even though everything that's taken place over the last almost year, it's hard to believe that we've almost been virtual for nearly a year now. It's hard. It has not been easy. It has not always been fun, even for me as a teacher. But it's still a blessing. It's still something great that we need to be grateful for, that we can interact with one another and learn from one another. And school is ultimately just a tool. Just like the court system is a tool, you can use it how you want to. If it's not something that you're super interested in, but you are really interested in entrepreneurship, or you're really interested in sociology and understanding how groups of people work together, you can use school to your benefit, regardless of what you're interested in. So you just have to be willing to kind of manipulate it to make it what you want. So I'll leave you guys with that. Be grateful for the people who've come before you and who have sacrificed and worked in really amazing ways, and take that as motivation to go forward. All right, jumping into the biology now. Put this over here. So not yesterday, but on Monday, we discussed aerobic respiration. Does anybody remember what this word aerobic means? Hopefully everybody does. Not necessarily air, or not, let's be more specific than air. You're on the right track, but there's a specific component of air that we need to think about. Oxygen, thank you, yeah. So aerobic means involving oxygen. Thanks, JT. So we can see the equation for aerobic respiration here at the bottom. Hopefully this is something you all have already written down. But we see that oxygen, O2, is one of the reactants in this equation. So this is the equation for aerobic respiration. But I also told you on Friday that there were other types of respiration, and we're going to discuss two of those types today. Both of those types are anaerobic respiration. So what do you think anaerobic means? If aerobic means involving oxygen, then what does anaerobic mean?
No oxygen.
Thank you, Lance. Yeah, anaerobic means no oxygen or absence of oxygen. So anaerobic respiration is not a very efficient process. And thank you as well, Dijon, for that answer. Anaerobic respiration can only produce about 2 ATP molecules per molecule of glucose. So it's not very efficient, because when we compare that to aerobic respiration, our cells are able to produce 36 molecules of ATP for every molecule of glucose. So it's about 18 times more efficient than anaerobic respiration. The two types of anaerobic respiration that we will discuss are alcoholic fermentation as well as lactic acid fermentation. And again, we really just need to remember anaerobic means without oxygen, and it's really just not nearly as efficient as using oxygen for respiration. Lactic acid fermentation uses glucose to create ATP, as again, only 2 ATP molecules. It also produces carbon dioxide, but it also produces lactic acid. And this only happens in organisms that have muscles, so in animals basically. But this lactic acid, if it builds up, can cause pretty severe cramps. As we can see, this person is experiencing what looks like a horrible cramp. So really the best way that you can kind of alleviate cramps, if you ever get them, is by taking in more oxygen so that your body can use that oxygen to do aerobic respiration. A cramp occurs with this buildup of lactic acid when your cells still need to make energy, but they don't have enough oxygen to do it. So they start doing this lactic acid process, and it can create serious cramps. So if you ever cramp up really badly, just try to slow your breathing, take in really deep breaths. stretch out your muscle and get as much blood circulating to the area as possible so it can carry more oxygen there. But again, lactic acid is a byproduct of this type of fermentation. The other type of fermentation is also anaerobic, but it's called alcoholic fermentation. And instead of producing lactic acid, it produces ethanol. Ethanol is literally the alcohol that is present in adult beverages. Alcoholic fermentation occurs in both yeast and bacteria. And so the yeast that are present in dough are going through this alcoholic fermentation process, and they're producing also carbon dioxide. And so that carbon dioxide is what actually causes the bread to rise up as those bubbles expand with heat.
Isn't that also the head of the beer?
What's that?
Isn't that also the head of the beer?
Yes, that's also what's happening when a beer gets foamy like this. All right. So again, we've got these equations. Does anybody remember what the equation for photosynthesis is? We've got a word bank at the bottom that could help. What are the reactants for photosynthesis? What are the reactants for photosynthesis?
H2O, carbon dioxide, and sunlight.
Good. Thank you. H2O, which is water, carbon dioxide, which is CO2, and then sunlight. We need those things for photosynthesis. What does photosynthesis produce?
Oxygen.
Oxygen.
As well as glucose. Can't forget that second part. And then we know that aerobic respiration is basically the reverse of photosynthesis. So we're just going to take these two products of photosynthesis and use them as reactants for aerobic respiration, oxygen and glucose. And then aerobic respiration produces CO2, ATP, which is energy, and water. Okay, cool. Now, this sets us up really well because we should be able to recognize that there's a clear cycle here. What photosynthesis produces is then used by aerobic respiration to produce the things that are then used by photosynthesis. So we're setting ourselves up nicely for a pretty clear cycle here. And here's what the cycle really looks like. Let's start with the plants. Plants take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to do photosynthesis. In the process of doing photosynthesis, they create glucose. That glucose is then a source of nutrients for maybe sometimes other plants, but also for animals, which can eat the plants. Animals eat the plants, and so now they get the glucose. Animals' cells, of course, are doing respiration. All living things do respiration. So they're using glucose to make energy. But as a byproduct of making energy, they're also making more CO2. So animals, including us, breathe out CO2 as our cells do respiration. And then that CO2 is then used by plants to kind of start the process again. We can also think about decomposition as a source of carbon within this cycle. When an animal dies, or even when a plant dies, when a leaf falls from a tree and dies, that leaf or that animal is going to return carbon to the soil if it's allowed to decompose. It returns carbon to the soil, and that carbon will then become a nutrient source for other plants or for other animals.
And in millions of years, coal is produced.
Right, yeah. Yes, animals that died and plants that died many, many millions of years ago then get subverted under the ground where they turn into coal or natural gas. But then there are also bad sources in this process too that we have to acknowledge that are not so good for the atmosphere. So as a result of industrialization, we use a lot of these energy sources to power our daily lives, to get around, for transportation, for agriculture, for energy needs within the household, to turn on lights, and even to do things that are more simple, like having a refrigerator requires a lot of energy. So we're producing a lot of sources of carbon and putting them into the atmosphere, more than has ever been in the atmosphere in the history of the Earth. Well, in the recent history of the Earth.
That's why bugs are getting smaller.
Would you say, Lance?
That's why bugs are smaller than they used to be.
What does that mean?
I think it was like in the Jurassic, bugs were like hundreds of times larger, weren't they? Because the atmosphere was more oxygenated.
Okay, yeah. I don't. That could very well be true. I'm not sure. I know, obviously, there were a lot of species. I think some scientists have estimated that over 90% of the species that have ever lived on Earth are now extinct. And that's not necessarily because of humans. Obviously, humans have contributed to some extinction, but there have been other what they call mass extinction events that have taken place. The Ice Age, volcanic eruptions. Of course, it is postulated, or it's hypothesized that there were, what am I trying to say, asteroids that hit the Earth as well, that killed off large numbers of species too. So it's not just humans, but we have seen these mass extinction events take place in the past. And because of that, there are species that once existed that we just don't know of now, besides the fossil record. So yeah, there are insects and other animals that we don't see anymore that had really unique properties, including being bigger than normal, I guess. So this is a cycle where we can actually track how carbon moves from the atmosphere to plants to animals back to the atmosphere, or from the atmosphere to coal to cars and back to the atmosphere. We can track these things. So this is the cycle. Okay, let's ask a question here. Let's see where your minds are. Why might a plant at the bottom of the rainforest benefit from the adaptation of having very large leaves? So we're in the rainforest. We've got these trees that are hundreds of feet tall, and below them on the ground level are shorter plants that might only be 3 feet tall. Why is it important that those shorter plants that are on the ground have large leaves? Is it A, to get more sunlight, B, to access more water, C, to produce more carbon dioxide, or D, to stop from being eaten? What do you all think? Lance has already jumped in with an answer. Anybody else want to give an answer? Abigail, I keep saying Michelle. Abigail has given an answer. I'd like to hear from a few other folks as well. Thank you, Lisa. She's given an answer too. Sway. Okay, we've got 3 different answers now. Is someone going to jump in and say D? Okay, JT, Dijon, and Lance are correct. The answer is A here. So I can see why the people who said B, but most water intake does not happen in the leaves. Where does most water intake happen?
Roots.
From the roots, yes. So plants get most of their water from the roots. They can take in a little bit in their leaves, but it's almost a negligible amount. So the leaves are there essentially to get sunlight. The leaves are there to take in sunlight. That's why there are so many chloroplasts in the cells that are in the leaves, because they need that sunlight to do photosynthesis. So when we're thinking about the rainforest, there's this huge canopy of trees above. And so this canopy is really, it's preventing sunlight from penetrating down to the ground. So if you ever get a chance, I have not been to a rainforest, but I have been to the Sequoia National Forest in California, which is similar. You've got this big canopy above you. It's pretty dark on the ground. It's not dark as in it looks like nighttime, but it's like you're under perpetual shade. So the plants that are, go ahead, Lance.
Someone can think of it as like a very dense fish net. Things will get through, just not as much. That's why the things at the bottom need bigger leaves to catch as much as they possibly can.
That's correct, yes.
And if anyone's ever and if any of you've done gardening before, you'll notice if you take all the dirt off of a plant, their roots, they're all white because they don't need any chloroplasts. They don't get any sunlight because they're under the ground. So they don't get any sunlight. All the chloroplasts is in leaves where they don't collect water, they collect the sunlight where they need it.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you for that lesson. I didn't even think to kind of talk about the different colors of the roots too, but so true. Yeah, so I don't think I need to say much more. A is the answer. Plants need large leaves for sunlight. Good job. Thank you, Lance. Okay, so
there is a type of bush type tree in the Amazon that collects water in the stem top, so animals can live there and they have a symbiotic relationship with them, but that's one genus of tree plant thing.
Interesting. Didn't know that either. So keep the information coming, Lance. Thank you. You were teaching us all today. So we can also chemically track the transfer or the movement of carbon through these processes as well. And we talked about this a little bit on Friday. We've got these coefficients here. This 6 is telling you that there are 6 carbon dioxide molecules. So that tells you there are 6 carbons as well. And then we've got a subscript here telling you that there are 6 carbons in 1 molecule of glucose. So it's the same amount of carbon. Again, this is called the law of conservation of matter. Things do not simply disappear or just randomly out of thin air appear in a chemical equation. Everything needs to be accounted for from beginning to end. So, and in reverse, this process of cellular respiration, we've got a glucose molecule that has 6 carbon atoms, and when it combusts with an oxygen or with 6 oxygen molecules, it creates 6 carbon dioxide molecules as well. You're all good, Lance. I definitely appreciate it. Keep it coming. All right. And again, this is just another depiction. So it's cool because the things that are needed by one process are produced by another, and vice versa. So as plants use energy from the sun, as well as oxygen, as well as carbon dioxide and water to make oxygen and glucose, that oxygen and glucose is then used by all living organisms to do respiration. So plants are doing both photosynthesis and respiration. Keep that in mind. And then as oxygen and glucose are used for aerobic respiration, they produce carbon dioxide and water, which can then be used again by these autotrophic organisms, these organisms that do photosynthesis. Okay. Now we're kind of switching here. This is kind of the midpoint in the lesson. We're going to talk about something else. So homeostasis, we mentioned this briefly in our discussion about Sternger in Unit 0, because one of the R's in Sternger stands for regulation, which is basically homeostasis. Homeostasis is maintaining a constant and stable internal balance. Every system in nature has some type of balance. And achieving this balance requires energy, to kind of tie it back into our discussion about aerobic respiration. If you all take chemistry, and if you go on to take physics, you'll learn about this concept called entropy. Entropy basically states that everything in nature becomes more chaotic, less ordered over time, unless you input energy into the system to make it more ordered, to organize it. So maintaining a balance requires energy. Maintaining homeostasis requires energy. But all systems in nature have achieved some type of balance. For example, the human body is a system that has achieved many different balances. We can think about the balance of temperature. Our body needs to remain at a temperature of about 98 degrees, 99 degrees Fahrenheit. If it falls outside of that range, meaning it goes above and gets too hot, or goes below and gets too cold, the body can begin to shut down and tissues can begin to die. We can also think about the water balance as well. The cells within our bodies need a lot of water. They need water not only for respiration, but also for transport, to be able to take things in and to release things and to send them to other parts of the body. So our body is really about 70% water. And again, if that deviates too far in one direction, it can begin to break the body down. So we've got, our brain is able to control things involuntarily to maintain a balance. What I mean by this is you don't have to think about sweating when you get too hot. Your body just automatically does it. You don't have to like sit down and concentrate for 30 seconds and be like, okay, it's time for me to start sweating so I can protect my organs. Your body does this for you. And then if you sweat too much and you start to dehydrate yourself, your body will tell you you're thirsty. You'll start to feel thirsty. Your mouth will get dry as your body is signaling to you, you need to take in some water. So there are specific parts of the brain, and if you all go on to take anatomy or psychology, you'll learn about these parts of the brain that are involuntary. We've got an entire, what am I trying to say? An entire department of our nervous system that is in charge of these autosomatic processes. They do them by themselves. We don't have to think about it. And this applies to a lot of different measurements. It could be pH, it could be water, it could be glucose, so your sugar level, it could be temperature. Okay. We talked about pH before as well, but I just wanted to provide a reminder. pH, as it says at the bottom of your screen, pH is a measure of how much hydrogen is in a substance, and therefore how acidic it is. The more hydrogen is dissolved in a substance, the more acidic that substance is. And we can see some common substances up there at the top. But our cells have the job of maintaining homeostasis, and they do this by exchanging different materials. Just to give you an idea of how sensitive our bodies are, you can see that the normal range for blood pH is extremely small. We really need to fall within that 7.35 to 7.45 range. Outside of that range, we begin to get sick. We might enter acidosis or alkalosis. And then if it gets really bad, the body will start to die. So we've got to maintain this normal pH. Ultimately, if there's too much carbon dioxide dissolved in your blood, your body is going to start to get too acidic. And so what happens is that your brain tells you, it'll increase your respiration rate. It'll start, you'll start breathing a little faster so you can breathe out more to get rid of some of that carbon dioxide, and breathe in more because oxygen is going to balance that carbon dioxide out. Okay. So this whole process of homeostasis is happening at the cellular level. It is the cell's job to maintain homeostasis. And this is facilitated by the cell membrane. The cell membrane, of course, regulates what enters and exits the cell. So in order to facilitate this process of homeostasis, the cell membrane has 4 special properties. Number 1, the cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. And this just means that it is made up of 2 layers of lipids. They've got a phosphate group head, and they've got lipid tails, and we'll see what I'm talking about. It's made up of 2 layers of lipids. The cell membrane is also flexible and fluid, meaning that it can move, it can shift and shape, and also things within it can move around as well. And those things that are within it contribute to why we call the cell membrane a mosaic. It's got different substances that are embedded inside of it. Lastly, the cell membrane is selectively permeable. It's picky. It only lets certain things in, and it only lets certain things out. So please do make sure that you're writing down at least these 4 properties.
Sorry, the link I just posted in the chat is a video about how a type of bacteria really deep in the ocean uses photosynthesis from hydrothermal vents. I think it's cool. It's only 4 minutes.
Thank you. Okay. So that bilayer that makes up the cell membrane has two regions. Really, it's got three regions, but two different regions. One of those regions is called hydrophobic, and this is the internal region of the cell membrane. Hydrophobic, it's not annoying, Lance. You're teaching us. I appreciate it. Keep sharing stuff, and that goes for everybody. If you come across interesting things, you should definitely share them. If no one else will watch it, I will. So I appreciate it. Hydro means water. Phobic means fear of something, like a phobia. So the hydrophobic region has a fear of water. These are non-polar substances that do not like water. It also has a hydrophilic region. It's got two of these hydrophilic regions. And you'll see exactly what I'm talking about over the next few slides. But philic or filio is a suffix that means love for something. So the hydrophilic region loves water. It likes to be in contact with water. I did not know that, Anna, but thank you for that, that interesting fact. Okay, so hydrophobic means that they don't like water. Hydrophilic means that they do. And so because these substances that are hydrophobic don't like water, they need to be insulated as much as possible. They need to be away from water as much as possible. And so this is what the bilayer eventually looks like. These red balls are the hydrophilic heads. These are the parts of the bilayer that do like water. So they face outwards in order to come in contact with water. And then the regions that are hydrophobic, the regions that don't like water, they face inwards to insulate themselves. Believe it or not, what we're talking about here is extremely, extremely small. So even something that is as small as a water molecule cannot fit through the membrane by itself. And so this protects these hydrophobic tails. They don't ever have to come in contact with water. I think I did know that one, Josue. I appreciate it. You guys should team up and do a commercial for biology. So we call it a phospholipid because the heads are phosphate groups and then the tails are lipids. So phospholipid bilayer, bi meaning two layers. So in your notes, I want you guys to take a couple minutes, just 2 minutes to draw this out. You might start with drawing your hydrophilic heads. Then you'll draw your hydrophobic tails. We've got the extracellular space, which faces outside the cell. And then we've got the intracellular space, which is on the inside of the cell, in the cytoplasm. Both spaces are aqueous. They're both essentially made of water. So the heads like that. They like to be in contact with those spaces, but the tails do not. Make sure you label as well. Okay. So we can see these properties actually moving in this animation. The balls at the top and at the bottom are the hydrophilic heads, meaning that they do like water. They like to come in contact with water. And then the strings that are kind of hanging down from those balls are the hydrophobic tails. We can also see how the membrane is able to move. It's fluid. So like I said, the cell membrane is a mosaic because it has a lot of different substances that are embedded inside of it. One of the most common substances is called a protein channel. And a protein channel is typically a big protein that is able to span across the membrane. So one side of it opens up to the inside of the cell, and then the other side opens up to the outside environment, the extracellular environment. This allows things that cannot move through the membrane by themselves to get through. For example, water molecules cannot move through the membrane. So they rely on a specific protein channel to get through to the other side. Also embedded in the membrane, you'll often find carbohydrate chains. These carbohydrate chains help to stabilize the cell membrane, as well as to identify the cell's environment. So please do write down these two things: protein channels and carbohydrates. Okay. So concentration is a concept that is really, really important across all sciences, physics, chemistry, biology. You'll hear it come up a lot. It's just a measurement of how much of something there is in a given volume. We use different units. Yeah, I can go back. This, Janelle? Okay, cool. So concentration is a measure of how much of something there is in a given volume, and we use different units to measure it. We in this class won't really be using measurements. You just need to be familiar with what I mean when I'm talking about concentration. But just to give you an idea, concentration is calculated by dividing the mass of something by the volume of its solution. So the mass of the solute divided by the volume of the solution of the solvent. So the units then would be grams per milliliter. Grams is a measurement of mass. Milliliter is a measurement of volume. You could also have grams per cubic centimeter, moles per liter. That's one that comes up in chemistry a lot. This is a concept called molarity. You'll learn about that in chemistry. Pounds per gallon. But let's say we've got two containers. They have the exact same volume because they're the same size. They're taking up the same amount of space. We've got different things that are in these containers. So I want to know the relative concentrations here. Which of our containers, the one on the left or the one on the right, has the greater concentration of yellow circles?
The right side?
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, we can see that there are more yellow circles on the right than there are on the left. So what this means is that the concentration of yellow circles is greater on the right than it is on the left. What about these purple squares? Where is the concentration greater?
The left?
Good. Thank you, everybody. And thanks, Melissa, for that last answer, too. Yeah, we've got six purple squares on the left and only 4 of them on the right. So the concentration is greater on the left. Same amount of volume, but because I have more of them, the concentration is greater on the left. What about of these smiley faces?
They're equal.
They are equal. Now, this is a special concept that we'll talk about, but we've got 5 smiley faces on both sides. So we've got an equal concentration. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Now, again, the extracellular space is the space that is outside of the cell. The intracellular space is inside of the cell's membrane. Oftentimes, what we end up with is a concentration gradient. A concentration gradient is a difference in concentration between one solution and another. So, for example, the solution on the outside of the cell is starting off with a greater concentration than the solution on the inside. We're starting off with these blue hexagons. All of them are on the outside and none of them are on the inside. So it's more concentrated on the outside and less concentrated on the inside. The role of the cell membrane is to let certain things in and let certain things out. So depending on the goal of the cell, this cell membrane can either maintain the concentration gradient, meaning it can keep things out. Let's say we don't want the salt. Let's say this is salt. Let's say that we don't want salt to come on the inside of the cell. The concentration gradient is going to be maintained by the cell membrane. The cell membrane is going to prevent salt from coming into the cell. Or the cell might say, hey, I want an equal amount. So what I need to do is to allow some of these molecules to flow inside of the cell until the concentration is the same on the inside as it is on the outside. When that happens, we have what is called equilibrium. The goal of most cells is to be in equilibrium, which means that the concentration of molecules is equal on both sides of the cell. You've got the same concentration on the inside of the cell as you do on the outside. So this concept of equilibrium is super important. Please make sure you're writing down the definition. I know we're running out of time shortly. But we've done a great job today. Thanks for pushing through with me. Okay. So now the question comes up, which molecules can cross the membrane? Because not everything can cross by itself. Some molecules can freely cross the membrane without help. Other molecules need help. They need to be able to move through a protein channel in order to get into the cell or to leave the cell. Small molecules can move through the membrane without any help. So these would be oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, O2, H2, N2. These are very, very small molecules. They don't need any help. Larger molecules, even like H2O, it's too big, can't move through by itself. It's going to need some help. Non-polar molecules can move through the membrane without help. This is a chemical concept that I won't explain right now. Polar molecules do need help. Uncharged molecules, meaning neutral molecules, they don't have a positive charge, nor do they have a negative charge. They are able to move through without help. But charged molecules, which we refer to in chemistry as ions, they do need some help to get across the membrane. So this might be potassium, which is K plus, or it could be sodium, Na plus. Or it could be sulfur, which is S2 minus. These charged molecules do need help to get across the membrane. So you might also want to include some of those examples down there as well. All right. So I know we're running out of time, so I just wanted to show you guys what there is to do. There are 2 assignments. One is called the carbon cycle. The other is called interactive cell membrane questions. There's also, of course, an exit ticket. I know we don't really have time, but let me make sure that this one is available to you all. I know we don't really have time to do those things. You might just knock out the exit ticket for now and come back and do those asynchronous assignments after school or tomorrow during lunch or whenever, tomorrow during advisory. But that's what we have for you guys to do today. Thank you for your hard work. I appreciate it. I don't think, do I have any? I know I have some appointments with some of you coming up, so I look forward to talking with you one-on-one. But other than that, I hope you have a good day, and I'll talk to you all tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
See you.